Welcome to the Brothers in Crime podcast.
We are brothers.
We talk about true crime.
We don't take ourselves too seriously.
And you shouldn't either.
This is the second part of the story of the murder of Laci and Connor Peterson. If you missed the first part, what are you doing? You should be listening to every episode. So go back and listen to episode 46 and then come on back here.
Scott Peterson was charged with 2 felony counts of murder with premeditation and special circumstances. He pleaded not guilty. This all went down in Stanislaus County Superior Court, and the trial ended up being moved to San Mateo County because of the concern that so many people in Stanislaus made up their minds about Scott's guilt. And March 4th, 2004, jury selection began, and it would take until May 27th for the 6-man, 6-woman jury to be seated. There were also 6 alternates that served in this case, and then the trial would get underway on June 1st. So let's kind of take a walk through sort of the evidence and the arguments that each side made. I want to start with the state's case. Now, clearly, if you follow this at all, then you know the biggest problem for the state was that there was a huge lack of direct evidence to link Scott to the crime. So with this, the state's case relied on circumstantial evidence, pointing in particular to Scott's behavior before and after Laci's disappearance. From a legal standpoint, the law makes no distinction between direct evidence and circumstantial evidence. It's not like direct, like you have to have direct for a conviction, or direct is better than circumstantial. The jury is entitled to weigh that evidence how it sees fit based on the facts of the case. So there's no requirement that there be direct evidence, and there's no requirement that, or there's no exception that you can't have a conviction only based on circumstantial evidence. Under the law, that's perfectly fine. Through various witnesses, the prosecution suggested Scott had several motives for killing Laci. That he was tired of his marriage and felt pressure from her pregnancy, that he wanted to continue his affair with Amber, and that he was under mounting financial pressure. And this would be their theme, right? That Scott didn't want to be a dad. He wanted to just continue to basically live out his frat boy golfer existence and hook up with other women, cheat on his wife, and he didn't want to deal with any of it. So he did the selfish thing, and he got rid of Laci and Connor. Prosecutors claim that Scott made those cement anchors to weigh Laci's body down in San Francisco Bay. And Laci's mom testified that when she went to East La Loma Park to search for Laci, she saw Scott there, but said that Scott didn't even acknowledge her calling out to him, and that he kind of angled away when she would try to hug him. And he also didn't attend one of these candlelight vigils. And other relatives of Laci said that Scott had shown little emotion during Laci's disappearance. 3 witnesses testified that Scott told them that he had been golfing, not fishing, after Laci's disappearance. In other words, whenever she went missing, we know now that he was out in his boat in the bay, but there were a handful of people who said that in the aftermath of that, when Laci was gone and they were searching, that he would say that he had been golfing that day when that was not the case. And he would tell police that he originally had planned to go golfing that day, but it was a cold, windy day, and so he decided to go fishing in the bay instead.
Well, that makes a lot of freaking sense, because it's toasty warm and there's no wind out on the bay.
Yeah, and my understanding is San Francisco Bay is a particularly windy place, so...
Right, and you're going to be on water that dissipates heat at 255 times the rate of air, so yeah, that makes a lot of sense, dumbass.
Bob has some feelings about this case, y'all. Now, the prosecution called on various witnesses to establish that Scott changed his appearance, purchased a vehicle using his mother's name, and added 2 porno TV channels to his cable service just days after Laci's disappearance. A realtor testified that in January, this is like January right after Laci's, missing, Scott expressed interest in selling the house that he had shared with Laci, saying he didn't want her to have to live in the home if she was found alive. And a car salesman testified that Scott had traded in Laci's Land Rover for a Dodge pickup truck.
Yeah, I remember that crap. At this point, she's still just missing. And It's not long after she went missing, but he's rolling up on West Covina with this fancy new pickup.
Watching the Playboy channel at night. Fry testified about her affair with Scott, and the jury heard those secretly recorded telephone calls between the 2 of them. And regarding the Petersons' financial condition, there was an auditor who testified for the prosecution that the couple had been living beyond their means and had accumulated $23,000 in credit card debt.
Well, you better go ahead and convict me of murder right freaking now. That's rookie shit there. 23 grand? But look, this whole deal, like, I do remember when he bought the truck and got rid of her car. At that time, the poor neighbors on that street, because the news from local and national and everywhere was just camped out along that street. Everything that dude did, we got to look at it because it was all on TV.
Yeah, it was plastered everywhere, that's for sure. During cross-examination, that same auditor also stated that Scott had paid all of his bills on time and had $20,000 of credit available on other cards. So it kind of balanced out this notion of this financial stuff. Now, other witnesses testifying in other areas said that neither of the 2 hair follicles found on Scott's boat belonged to Scott, though he said he couldn't determine whether they belonged to Laci. But the state called another expert, an FBI trace expert, who testified that she was able to match one of the hairs to a hair found in Laci's hairbrush through that mitochondrial DNA testing. At this time, that was kind of new, controversial to an extent, and wasn't allowed. There were certain states and courts where that wasn't allowed, like mitochondrial DNA testing couldn't be used in a criminal case for comparison purposes. Now, the prosecution further suggested that the hair must have come from Laci's dead body because she'd not seen the boat while she was alive.
She wasn't. Who hadn't seen the body? Oh, Laci.
I'm sorry. So essentially, the state said that the hair had to come from Laci's dead body because she had not been to the boat when she was alive. That was the state's claim.
Oh, well, here's my problem with that. If we're talking about a single hair, like, I mean, if you find like a whole handful of somebody's hair ripped out of their head somewhere, that means something. But a single hair, I don't know. I've been riding along in my truck and I look down and there's a hair that ain't mine. I don't know who the hell's it is. Hairs just have a way of, hitchhiking and ending up places you don't expect them to be. So
yeah,
I don't like this dude at all. And, my gut says he did it, but, who knows? He could be innocent. But still, I can't just, jump on the bandwagon with bullshit evidence.
Yeah, one hair is not a lot. And we'll talk about the hair a little bit more when I get to the defense side of the case. So just put a pin in that, hang on to it. There's another prosecution witness, a guy named Robert O'Neill, was asked to comment on Scott's claim that he had used a 90-pound bag of cement to make a single anchor and then fill in or cover up this kind of messed up area of the driveway. O'Neill said that the material in the anchor did not match a sample of concrete from the driveway because the driveway sample featured large gravel-like chunks. And we'll talk more about that with the defense expert here in a second. Turning to the bay, the state also had an expert who had helped lead over 15 diving expeditions off the Berkeley Marina to search for Laci. He testified that thick mud, strong currents, dark waters, and a strong surge could make it virtually impossible for sonar equipment to locate an object, even when the target is known, and that explained why they were unable to find Laci's body or any anchors. To emphasize this point, the expert said that when his crew accidentally dropped the underwater sonar device into the water while they were out there doing some work, it took them 4 diving trips to locate it, even though the crew knew exactly where this equipment had landed. The state also called a hydrologist with the United States Geological Survey as an expert witness on tides in the San Francisco Bay. And he suggested that Laci may have been dumped near where Scott had said he was fishing. So again, kind of like how he told Amber that this was going to be the first Christmas without his wife, now you have this incredibly, how do you even put it into words, coincidence, quote unquote, that he's apparently fishing over the same spot where, according to the state, his wife's body was dumped in the same exact bay. Any thoughts on the state's case? I mean, we're going to talk about what the defense's kind of counter-arguments, some of their experts and their points were here, but any sort of just...
No, I mean, I think they could have gotten a conviction as soon as Amber Fry showed up. And if there were any questions about that when the bodies popped up, I mean, I think the prosecution could have made their case in about 10 minutes.
Yeah, I mean, I really think that she really is like the turning point in this whole case. If you take her out, I think it becomes a much closer question about whether the state's going to be able to get a conviction or not. So let's go ahead and talk about some of the defense, their best arguments, their case, and the evidence that they presented, or the way that they counteracted the evidence that was presented by the state.
His defense, did he have Mark Garagos?
He did. That's a good memory, Bob. He did.
Yeah, I like that guy. I don't think I've liked any of his clients, but no, I take that back. I like Michael Jackson.
Maybe we'll cover that sometime. So the defense's best arguments, right? Number one, there's no direct evidence in this case. So even though you don't have to have direct evidence, the reality is, if you got somebody who's on trial for, the death penalty, it's a little unnerving, I would think, if I'm a juror, to have in front of me a case where there's literally nothing that directly ties this defendant to the crime. And so the defense argued that this investigation wasn't thorough because they just honed in on Scott from the jump. That essentially, they were suspicious of him and they decided that he did it, and then they just built a case out to show that he did it and didn't consider any other possibilities. To kind of support this theory, here's a sample of some of the things that they would kind of went through and presented at trial, but they talked about how a police community service officer testified that the playback of an interview with Scott had no sound because no batteries had been put in a tape recorder that was used to record it. So in addition to this notion that they weren't thorough because they'd honed in on Scott, they also presented these different instances that showed sort of like an ineptitude or just a general lack of competent policing, which is a pretty typical defense tactic. In addition to that, the state couldn't say how Laci died. They couldn't say where Laci died. They didn't know when she died. And so you have all these questions. Most of the evidence the state has can be explained. This was another argument they made. It was just whether you bought the state's explanation or you bought Scott's explanation, right? So for all of these things, it would be point and counterpoint, point and counterpoint. The problem was, the state was able to show that Scott had this really questionable character traits about him because of the stuff that he did with Amber and some of the other things that happened after Laci went missing, like the porn channels and talking to the realtor and buying a pickup truck. So there's a lot of behavior here that is incredibly bizarre, and so you can try to explain that away, but when you take it in the aggregate, it really doesn't look good.
I'm all the way back to when you were explaining the no direct evidence, how the defense was explaining that, and then when you got into they don't know how she died, they don't know where she died, they don't know when she died. I think this can be summed up as the Bart Simpson defense when he said, I didn't do it, nobody saw me do it, you can't prove anything.
Yeah, basically. I mean, that's their argument. And the counterpoint to that, while we're kind of in this point counterpoint now that we've laid out the state's case and we're talking about the defense case, like I said earlier, right, there's in the law, it's not that direct evidence isn't favored over circumstantial evidence. And a good illustration that lawyers and judges commonly use for this is, if you're watching a movie at a movie theater and you come out of the theater part and you're in the lobby and you see people walking in and you see water dripping off their coats and you see people carrying wet umbrellas and the floor is wet where the doors are, you can very safely assume that it is raining or did rain outside, right? You didn't see it rain, you're not out there in the rain, but based on everything in front of you, it's pretty clear that those people are coming inside from the rain, or they've been in the rain. That's an example of where circumstantial evidence can be just as helpful as direct evidence. You don't have to necessarily feel the raindrops on your face to know that it's raining outside, or that it just rained outside. So you're right, Bart Simpson defense, and the reality that just because they can't answer these questions doesn't mean that you can't have a conviction in a case like this. To the point about the evidence potentially being able to be explained away, this part is somewhat concerning about the police investigation. You remember how the state put on an expert who said that Laci's hair was found on the boat with pliers, it was on top some pliers or whatever, and that the state claimed that Laci had never been on the boat alive.
Right.
Which would be pretty significant, right? I mean, potentially. To your point, you make a great point, like hair transfer, that happens, whatever. But what if I told you that Laci had, in fact, been at the boat or in the boat or on the boat, whatever, I don't know how you say that, when she was alive? A witness reported that she had seen Laci at the warehouse with the boat the day before she was reported missing. And you might say, well, who found the witness? Well, on the witness stand, Detective Braccini explained that he had excised that witness's statement from his police report. What do you think about that?
Why?
Right, that raises a lot of questions. I'm sure, there could be all sorts of innocent reasons for that, but Scott would say, well, there could be all sorts of innocent reasons for all the things they're saying that I did. So,
yeah, I mean, the only logical reason I can think that would be okay to take that out of the report or leave it out of the report is if you have credible, obvious evidence this person is delusional or a liar.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely not great. Let's get back to those concrete anchors, though, because that's a big part of kind of the state's theory that he built these concrete anchors and that he used them to, tie to her body and then put her in the bay.
Concrete anchors sounds like a solid plan.
Yeah, so the state theorized that he used multiple anchors to weigh down Laci's body so she would stay underwater. And they had an expert who testified that the concrete that they found in the driveway was not the same concrete that was used to make that single anchor that was left over. But an expert for the defense, who was a concrete expert, testified that the samples were consistent. He said that the gravel chunks had adhered to the driveway's concrete because the concrete was poured on top of those chunks, lots of chunks. Scott's defense attorney also pointed out that no such anchors were found after a search of the floor of the San Francisco Bay with that sonar equipment that's accurate enough to locate objects as small as a tin can. So the expert, you've got this, it can find really small stuff, but then also, certain conditions it can be harder to find things.
Yeah, battle of the experts.
Exactly. At the end of the day, though, trials are really all about telling a story. And the story has to be believable. It has to be compelling. Sometimes in life, things happen that are unbelievable. But it doesn't matter. The best lawyers put together a narrative through the evidence. They have to. In this case, the defense's narrative was to suggest that someone had kidnapped Laci, held her until she gave birth, and then dumped Laci and Connor's bodies in the bay.
Yeah, dumped 60, 80 miles from her home in the same bay where Scott happened to go fishing while she was being disappeared. Doesn't sound like a great story for Scott to me.
I mean, I'm sure his attorney wished that he had different facts to work with because he didn't have a lot to work with here. And frankly, like I said, it comes down to telling a compelling story. Which story is more believable and compelling? This one about some random kidnapping and then like she gives birth and then their bodies are dumped, and that just seems crazy because why? There's no why behind that. It doesn't make any sense. Or the story about the guy who's cheating on his wife with the massage therapist and is telling her, this is going to be my first Christmas without my wife, who happens to disappear on Christmas Eve. And then her body is found in the same bay where he went fishing, an hour and a half away. And then all the other stuff on top of it. So one of those is a much more riveting, compelling story.
Well, Scott definitely fits the archetype of I murdered my wife and I'm lying to my side chick character.
It does seem like he's like straight out of a Lifetime movie, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
Jury deliberations began on November 3rd, 2004, and on November 12th, Scott Peterson was found guilty of first-degree murder for Laci's death and second-degree murder for Connor's death. Then on December 13th, the jury recommended that Scott Peterson be sentenced to death. On March 16th, 2005, so, a few months later, the judge followed the jury's recommendation and sentenced Scott Peterson to die. But lawyers, right, Bob?
Yeah, for the most part, death penalty cases and death penalty sentences just mean a ton of money and a ton of time and resources invested in getting to a life sentence.
Yeah, you're not wrong at all. And in this case, it would be no different. His appeals, they would go on and on and on and are still going on. We'll get to that in a second. But I'm not going to get into the weeds on this because I could, and I think that would bore people. But some high points throughout this process. In March of 2019, Governor Newsom signed an executive order that issued a moratorium on executions of death row inmates in California, and that included Peterson. So as of March 2019, that's put the kibosh on that. Then in August of 2020, the case was remanded to a lower court because California's Supreme Court had overturned the death sentence. To be clear, not the conviction, just the death sentence itself. And so the case was remanded, sent back to a lower court to determine what Peterson's penalty should be. So in an automatic appeal, which was first filed with the Supreme Court in 2012, okay, so this happens in 2020, but this appeal was first filed in 2012.
Okay.
The court found that potential jurors were dismissed erroneously, in part because they had expressed general objections to the death penalty on a questionnaire. So the opinion said, in this case, While a court may dismiss a prospective juror as unqualified to sit on a capital case if the juror's views on capital punishment would substantially impair his or her ability to follow the law, a juror may not be dismissed merely because he or she has expressed opposition to the death penalty as a general matter. So in other words, you can't just stack the jury full of people who are ready to flip the switch. If some people have reservations, as long as they're willing to follow the law and listen to the judge, that's okay. And if you think about it, it kind of makes sense, right? Because based on what the court did here, according to this opinion, you've essentially removed anybody who would potentially vote, if he was convicted, vote for a life sentence in favor of the death penalty. So you've kind of stacked the jury with people who are pro-death penalty, overly pro-death penalty, essentially. Nothing in the questionnaire showed that the dismissed jurors would have been unable to vote for the death penalty if the circumstances warranted it. And the court went on to say the death sentence must be reversed and the people given another opportunity to seek that penalty before a properly selected jury if they so choose. And the case was remanded to the county superior court to handle the sentencing. And then in October 2020, so same year, a bit later, the Supreme Court ordered the San Mateo County Superior Court to re-examine Peterson's murder convictions. So now they're saying, hey, lower court, trial court, you got to take a look at these again, because a juror did not disclose involvement in other legal proceedings, including being the victim of a crime. And that was kind of interesting. So there was a juror who, in the questionnaires that these prospective jurors had to fill out ahead of time, had answered some questions, and some of the questions had to deal with, have you ever been a victim of a crime? Have you ever been involved in legal proceedings? Things like that. And essentially, she felt like she answered it, according to her statements and stuff after the fact, she felt like she answered it truthfully, and that things that she had left out were things that weren't important to the court's consideration of her jury service. And ultimately, that ended up, that all got considered at the trial court level, and his conviction was not overturned. In December of 2021, Scott was resentenced to life without the possibility of parole. And then in October 22, he's moved from death row at San Quentin to Mule Creek State Prison in another part of California. And that gets us closer to now. In April of 2023, his attorneys, Scott's attorneys, filed a petition for writ of habeas corpus, which is a fancy phrase that essentially says, hey, let me out, in which they alleged that violations of state and federal constitutional rights and state statutory rights, including a claim of actual innocence that is supported by newly discovered evidence. And then most recently, in January 2024, the Los Angeles Innocence Project says that it began representing Scott Peterson as a client and that it is investigating his claim of actual innocence. So even though the appellate court threw out the death penalty after 15 years in prison, Scott did not, as of the date of this recording, has not gotten that new trial that he's been hoping for. But like I said, the Los Angeles Innocence Project has jumped in and kind of is helping out with the representation of him just here in January of 2024. And it seems like they're kind of tagged along with his attorneys who filed this April 2023 petition. So you've been quiet for a while, Bob. You still tracking? You still over there?
Yeah, it's just a whole lot of this state, this appeal, that, whatever. The Innocence Project being involved is very interesting. So I don't think they just grab whatever case and take it. It seems like they do a little homework first.
That's very true. When I was in law school, I actually worked as a student in the Innocence Project clinic at the law school that I went to. And I've seen a lot of, there's some misunderstandings about a lot of things with this, right? And it's funny, the backlash online, especially on like Twitter and stuff, was just crazy to me that people are, I'm never giving money to the Innocence Project again. I've lost all respect in the Innocence Project, this, that, and the third.
Well, but the Innocence Project might be right.
Here's my thing, right? The Innocence Project is not out here to get people off on technicalities. Like, that's not what it's about. And they make that pretty clear. And in this case, like, if they're getting involved, exactly what you said, there's a process for that. And to be clear, this isn't like the Innocence Project that's in New York, that's like the original entity, Barry Scheck and Peter Neufeld. This is the Los Angeles Innocence Project. But it follows the same kind of ideals and generally speaking, they're doing the exact same kind of things. In my experience from being a student attorney in one of those, like you said, there's a process to it. And I don't know that every school's Innocence Project does the exact same thing, but I can tell you, we screen cases. and we screened cases as teams, and then the team got together as a whole clinic. And if our clinic was going to take on even just interviewing somebody prospectively for representation, the whole clinic had to agree. Like, we had to all agree that this was a case that we should take, and that there was potential merit there, and that there were, there was like a checklist of, you got to meet these criteria. And I mean, I'll tell you, out of you get a lot of letters and a lot of applications and a lot of packets. And out of all those, most of them, for various reasons, they don't meet it. And a lot of times people would write in and say stuff like, yeah, I killed him, but he deserved it. Can you represent me? I respect that. You're being honest. But anyway, so yes, there's a process. There's a whole thing to it. It's not the kind of thing that just willy-nilly happens. For them to put their weight behind this doesn't mean that he's innocent. I don't think that for a second. It means that they see something that's worth looking into and that they believe should be fully checked out. And frankly, I mean, isn't that what we all want? At the end of the day, Laci and Connor should have justice, which all we can offer in this world, in this lifetime, is to have whoever's responsible to be convicted and to be punished to the fullest extent of the law. That's all we've got.
Absolutely. As somebody that has felt pretty much since the beginning that Scott did it, if he didn't, if I'm wrong and he didn't, then by all means, let's try and get the real scumbags in prison.
Right. And so to kind of jump into, because, I was really interested in, well, what is it that the Innocence Project saw? Because to your point, they had to see something. They're not going to get involved in a case where there's just nothing. It's all been checked. It's all been tested. And there's no argument. There's no bad forensics. There's no DNA that needs tested. There's no, there's got to be one of these things that's floating out there that they can work up and look into. And there's kind of these three areas of evidence, but I would say the big one, the newer thing, is that there's been this guy who was like an investigator with a fire department, whatever. The day after Laci disappeared, less than a mile from the Peterson house, they discovered a van that had been burnt out, like set on fire. It was all, charred up and flamed out. And this is on Christmas morning the next day. Inside the van was a mattress with a human blood stain on it. This might have absolutely nothing to do with Laci's disappearance, with Laci's murder, but in this area where it seems like things like this aren't typical, or at least aren't happening all the time, to have a burnout van with a bloodstained mattress in the back less than a mile from a house where a lady disappeared and is eventually found murdered, I mean, that could even point to Scott being the one who did it, and maybe he used this van. I have no idea. But it seems like it's relevant enough that it should at least be looked into. And that's what they're asking. They're asking for some DNA testing on that bloodstained mattress and to look at that. And I think part of, you can imagine, right? If this gives us a fuller picture of what happened that day, then that's a good thing. And we should have it. At the same time, if they test it and it's somebody else's, maybe it helps to figure out what happened in another case, or if nothing else, it shuts the door on this particular line of inquiry.
Right, yeah, and it might lead to something in a, cold missing persons case.
Exactly. Well, yeah, I mean, look at the Colonial Parkway murders, right? Like that, we end up finding out who the guy is that did the crime based on the fact that he died in his house and sat there and, turned into human jelly over time, and so they had to make sure it was actually him and not, somebody else. And
right.
So just coincidentally now, bam, you found this guy who's responsible for these things. So I'm all about testing this and seeing what comes out of it. I think that's a good thing. Now, how that impacts Scott's case, well, we'll see. The other things that they're bringing up in this petition and that they're looking at as evidence that they think needs to be reexamined, and this has come up in all the coverage that you look at about this case, was that robbery across the street from the Peterson house. So the state says that the burglary is completely, it's of no moment. It doesn't matter, because they say that it happened on December 26th, which would be 2 days after Laci had disappeared, so they say it's completely irrelevant. The Los Angeles Innocence Project is asking for clarity on the date that it occurred, and the reason for that is because the person who committed the robbery says, yeah, it happened on the 26th, and yeah, I'll take polygraphs and I'll do whatever I have to do to prove it. And the police have just been like, yeah, see, look, they've been super cooperative. They've told us when they did the robbery, all these things. Well, don't you think, hypothetically speaking for a second, if you're the guy who kidnapped and killed a pregnant lady, and you could just explain that away by saying you did a robbery, that you'd say you did a robbery?
If I'm understanding what you're asking, it's if a guy that didn't seem to have a problem kidnapping and killing a pregnant lady also wouldn't have a problem lying about what day he committed a robbery.
Well, or even just copping to the robbery so that he avoids, I did the robbery, lying about what day he did it and saying, I did the robbery on this day, because then that exonerates me from being the guy who did the actual, kidnapping and murdering.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So, I mean, why are we trusting this criminal? Let's verify that, right? Let's look at other evidence. And some people have said, well, by the 26th, there were news and whatever else set up on the street. So you're saying if this robbery happened on the 26th, that these guys went in and robbed this house while there were news vans and crews. And so that's a question that's just, it's odd. And so there's evidence and witnesses and people that say both things in both ways. And so the Innocence Project wants to clear that up. And for good reason, because if the robbery occurred on the 26th, and it seems like it would be completely unrelated, has nothing to do with it.
Yes.
If the robbery occurred the exact same day she went missing, then it seems more relevant. And it goes back to that argument at trial by the defense that the police didn't investigate this case as thoroughly as they should have. They didn't look into everything they should have. So that's where they're at with that. And then the last area of evidence, which has come up a good bit too, is, these sightings of Laci with the dog, right? There's a whole, I don't know if you're familiar with this, but there's this whole who saw her, when they saw her. But there was another pregnant lady that had a similar looking dog in the neighborhood. And so did they see Laci? Did they see the neighbor? Who did they? It's like a whole thing.
Yeah, it seems like I've seen several documentaries that are all about the dog and the walking and the 1018 and getting really wrapped around that.
Yeah, and there is. And the reason why this becomes such a sticking point is if anybody conclusively, if there was video footage of Laci out walking her dog alive after Scott left and went to the marina, then he's not dumping her body in the bay when they say he's dumping her body in the bay.
Right.
So at the end of the day, that's why this piece is so crucial. If they could find a way to provide concrete, actual evidence that she was, alive and out walking the dog once he had left for the bay.
And that daggone dog, beautiful, adorable dog, but that dog, it seemed like everybody was busy putting that dog back in the gate.
Right.
Like the whole neighborhood knew if Mackenzie was out, just back in the gate, and then another neighbor would come find him.
Yeah, exactly. So final thoughts on this case. I thought a lot about our first episode with Dorothy Donovan and Charles and how it just seemed unbelievable. His story is insane. Like, how can you believe that? And some of these Innocence Project wrongful conviction cases we've covered where, like Kennedy Brewer, right? He's there home with the kids. The police don't really see any sign of a forced break-in. There's these kids, they're in the same room or whatever, and then this guy's there. How does somebody just get in and take these kids without him knowing, or this child without him knowing? And then bite mark evidence, is used against him to say that he did it. So there's this part of me that's just like, yeah, I'm with you, right? Is Scott an absolute turd? 100%. There's no question about his character being completely flawed. Does logic say that the most likely Occam's razor here is that he was involved in whatever way with disappearing and or murdering his wife? For sure. I think that is the simplest explanation that makes the most sense. But having seen what I've seen and been involved with what I've been involved with, I feel a lot better if we go through this process of making sure that these other things that are kind of outliers, let's run those down. Let the Innocence Project run those down. And at the end of the day, if they come back and there's nothing there, there's nothing there. And he'll stay in prison. And I don't think I'll lose sleep about it. And, my gut, like you, my gut says he probably did it.
It looks like it. It smells like it. It walks like it. It quacks like it. On the other hand, like you said, things a lot stranger than Scott Peterson being innocent have turned out to be true. So we'll see.
Yeah, we will see. So, hit us up on social, right? We're on all the things. We're on Facebook, Twitter, whatever. What do you guys think? Scott Peterson do it? Did he not do it? How do you feel about the Innocence Project getting involved? Let us know what you think.
Hey, thanks for hanging out with us on the Brothers in Crime podcast. Feedback and suggestions are always welcome. For links and resources related to this episode, please see the show notes or visit us at brothersincrimepodcast.com. We hope you'll save, subscribe, or bookmark us on your favorite podcast site and join us for the next episode.